The Atomic Voices series was started, well, some 2.5 years ago at MTA. You know, like many things in this world, the issues that it is designed or it was set up to tackle were certainly not new. We're not, 2.5 years old and did not come into existence, did not command, should have commanded attention a lot earlier. But there's kind of a certain set of events and a certain set of circumstances that brings these issues into a higher relief. And for this particular series, what served as an impetus was, of course, the outrage over police brutality in the United States and the unjust and unequal treatment, discriminatory treatment of people of color that kind of grew into the Black Lives Matter movement and forced a lot of institutions to do very painful and very necessary rethinking about how they kind of handle their own policy, their own both institutional hiring policies, but also how do they engage with the subject matter that they are called to examine, to analyze, and so forth. So as an initiative from the fellows of the Managing the Atom program and also some of the staff, we can pull together to launch a series of webinars that would examine the less traditional, the more marginalized voices and perspectives in the nuclear field. My name is Mariana Bujarin. I'm a senior research associate at MTA, and I welcome all of you to this seminar. It's a seminar number 8. There will be there's a website or a separate page on our website, an MTA website, that contains the recordings of all of the previous seminars. This seminar as well will be recorded and posted on a website later on. But I do urge all of you in the audience, if you do want to attribute or cite any of the opinions, any of the materials that will be discussed here, please do not do so without the consent of the speaker. So please reach out to them first. This particular seminar will focus on a nuclear injustice, or rather nuclear injustices. There are multiple. And it was sparked, again, like many of the issues we're grappling with. None of these topics are new, right? These are inherent traits of an order, of a kind of grand international architecture, and the elements of which in which we all live. But as perhaps with the kind of origins of the Black Lives Matter movement, now we're looking that there's a series of events. There's now a new war, a major war in continental Europe, and it forces us to re-examine and re-peruse some of these old and very pernicious issues in the global nuclear order. And so let me introduce then our esteemed speakers. All of them were part of the roundtable on nuclear injustices that was published just recently in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and you can check there, or you can read their contributions there online. There were some other participants of that roundtable as well, and you can consult their contributions. And let me just thank our participants for agreeing to come for this important and very timely discussion. And I will introduce them briefly. There's their full bios. I'll post them in the Q&A, or maybe JJ can do that for me once I'm done. But let me just welcome first Franziska Sterk, who is a researcher in the Arms Control and Emerging Technologies program at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. Her research focuses on the intersection of critical security studies and nuclear arms control, with a particular interest in intergenerational justice and nuclear weapons, something I think we'll certainly focus on in today's discussion. She is an accomplished young scholar. She studied political science and rhetoric at the University of Tübingen and international security at Sciences Po in Paris, where Benoit is located. Marie Faines is a partner for mobilization at Global Zero, with oversight of movement building strategies. Wonderful. Which navigate the intersection of nuclear disarmament and social justice through tactics, including grassroots organizing, policy engagement, and coalition building. She engages with nuclear intersectionality, conflict resolution, transitional justice, and racial disparities in the US and African diaspora. And she currently serves on the steering committee for Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. She's engaged in a range of other. She's a very, very active scholar. She's engaged in a variety of really interesting projects, and she has published also widely in The Guardian and New America, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, Instinct Media, and so forth. And last but certainly not the least is Benoit Pelopidas, who is the founder of the famous Nuclear Knowledges Program at Sciences Po. And he's an affiliate of the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. He's a frequent visiting fellow at Princeton. He's an incredibly accomplished scholar that has published very widely on really interesting and kind of critically re-examining some of the sort of mainstream cases and concepts, and very importantly brings this idea of nuclear futures, multiple, right, plural, to the discussions and how we imagine the future in a way that is not just an extrapolation of the past. Without further ado, I will turn to our first speaker, Franziska, with a few few introductory remarks. Then I will ask Marie to speak, and then Benoit. And the way the seminar will proceed, I will probably have a few questions to all of you, and then we can open the discussion up to the audience. Please feel free to post questions even as the speakers are presenting into the Q&A box, and I will parlay them to the speakers. So without further ado, thank you all, welcome, and Franziska, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Mariana, for this really kind introduction and also for having me. It's a real privilege, and I'm really excited about today's topic of nuclear injustice. So I will start my remarks by saying that Russia's war against Ukraine basically got ordinary people to stare in the nuclear abyss way more often than we're usually comfortable with, and especially in the Euro-Atlantic area. So what people see is actually a monstrosity, a monstrous nuclear injustice. A nuclear weapon state invades a non-nuclear armed state and shields that with nuclear threats. So I think especially the latter is rather novel, and it should absolutely concern us. And it may be a turning point in how we talk about the legitimacy, but also the sustainability of the global nuclear order, which is currently unjust. So, and I would also argue it is a moment for politicization and for new thinking. And I think here scholars, and probably especially next generation scholars, do have a role to play. So together with my colleague Ulrich Kühn, who today unfortunately can't be with us because he's celebrating his birthday, so he has a really good excuse, together we pushed for a research agenda that focuses on nuclear injustice. And we invited several colleagues to contribute pieces to a bulletin roundtable. Mariana just said it, like you can find that online if you want to check it out. And we did that for them to help us, of course, with this endeavor, but also point out some aspects that we have certainly overlooked. So I'm super happy that we can actually discuss this together. And again, thanks to Mariana and the whole team for making this happen. Well, as you also said, we're of course not the first ones to realize, oh, the global nuclear order is unjust, right? Granted. But what we try to do here is really grasp and address nuclear injustice in its entirety and connect the dots between the different injustices, be they political or be they temporal. So let me probably first focus a bit on the political aspects of nuclear injustice. The global nuclear order is built on deterrence, nonproliferation, and disarmament. And I will argue that each of these three pillars has a massive justice problem. So let me run you through that and let me give you some examples. The deterrence pillar is probably the easiest. We just have to look at Ukraine. And this war really shows that some states can basically hide behind nukes while others can't. And the human cost of this nuclear order that is basically built on hierarchical spheres of insecurity, that cost we can see now. And the nuclear order that has a nuclear center and a nuclear periphery does come with consequences, and its injustice has become very obvious during the last year. So if we move next to the non-proliferation pillar, we can actually sadly stick to the Ukraine example. This country gave up its Soviet nukes on its territory, joined the NPT, and thereby, well, helped advance international non-proliferation. And it is now being invaded by a depository state of the NPT. And please don't get me wrong, I'm not making the Ukraine got invaded because it gave up its nukes argument. I think it's an ahistorical argument that is often made in bad faith. What I'm saying is that the non-proliferation regime itself failed Ukraine, and it could fail others in the future due to its unjust nature. So the thing is, the NPT leaves non-nuclear weapon states vulnerable to what some French think tankers have in a really fancy fashion called aggressive sanctuarization. So let us simplify this a bit. If nuclear weapon states decide to leverage their nuclear weapons for political or military gain, and this is what Russia is doing right now, there is no protection whatsoever against this direct exploitation of the unequal non-proliferation obligations of the NPT, rendering these obligations, well, fundamentally unjust. And this brings me to the last political aspect, the disarmament pillar. The NPT has made the fulfillment of member states' non-proliferation commitments a matter of individual safeguards. So there's this really tight control regime via the International Atomic Energy Agency. And I'm not a non-proliferation expert, but in general, I think we can agree it's a good thing that we have rules here. But at the same time, the NPT has left the issue of possible disarmament non-compliance by nuclear weapon states mostly unattended. So nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states are not only treated differently in the global nuclear order with the NPT at its heart, they don't have the same means to claim justice. And that means that we have both substantive and procedural injustice at play here. So this is a rough sketch of the global unjust nuclear order we are dealing with today. And I will now argue that this security architecture actually also comes with past and possible future injustices. So I'm now moving to the temporal aspects of nuclear injustice here. So let's probably first look at the past. And if we do that, of course, we have to acknowledge that colonialism has been probably the main driver of nuclear injustice. If we speak about uranium mining, nuclear testing, but also nuclear use, all of these things had an impact, and often racialized and gendered impact on local communities who in the end had to bear the cost of the legacy of nuclear weapon states. And here I have to say the Atomic Voices seminar has actually done a fantastic job at showing that these effects are not necessarily a thing of the past, they are ongoing. So these historic justice grievances, together with the international injustice between states that I tried to outline a moment ago, they shape policy choices, but also the perception of the legitimacy of the global nuclear order today. So pointing out that the absence of large-scale aggression between nuclear armed states that nuclear weapons seem to bring, at least this is what policymakers think, that this is the main thing that nukes do. Pointing out that this has come with a cost and still does is absolutely crucial, because this stability, and I'm putting that in brackets here now, the stability for the few does come at the expense of the many. So, and this is so important, because if we want to address nuclear injustice, some approaches that simply say, all right, actually true, it's kind of unfair that some states have nukes and others don't, let's just give more nukes to everybody. So basically focusing on equal access to the alleged benefits of nuclear deterrence. These approaches, of course, miss the point, because what they do is basically trading one injustice for another injustice. So you try to solve the international injustice, but thereby you enhance the human injustices that come with the possession of nuclear weapons. And I would say, generally speaking, it's just never really a good idea to trade one injustice for another injustice. And this idea gets, I think, even more problematic once you factor in future generations. So now I'm moving to the last temporal aspect of nuclear injustice here. Nuclear weapons and the global nuclear order basically perpetuate intergenerational injustice. So why is that? I would argue that the potentially catastrophic harm caused by nuclear weapons and by a nuclear war, well, that potential harm is basically again and again inherited to successive generations. And of course, each generation hopes that things don't go wrong for them, right? And each generation hopes to outsource the potential cost of the deterrence practices that they practice to far away generations. And of course, large-scale deterrence failure is a low probability event, however, with devastating consequences for all generations past a certain point where things probably could go wrong. And if we acknowledge that these future generations past that certain point are actually bearers of rights, just like we are, just like the next generation is, and just like a generation is in 100 years' time. And if we then conclude that this means that we have duties towards these generations, for example, ensuring their livelihoods, then of course we must ask ourselves if past and present generations' policies could ultimately reduce their options below a relevant threshold. And nuclear winter would arguably do that. So this is why nuclear weapons are an intergenerational justice issue. And, you know, let's set aside for a moment the whole thing about nuclear winter. Nuclear arms racing also comes with staggering opportunity costs. And I'm not only talking about financial opportunity costs, but about political opportunity costs. So deterrence practices do take away resources from, well, my generation and future generations to tackle other really urgent global problems that we probably should focus on, right? So talking about these other urgent global problems, I think there are differences in quality, but overall there are striking parallels between the climate and the nuclear realm when it comes to intergenerational injustice. And just as an observation, I think as a society as a whole, we have somehow acknowledged that outsourcing harm to future generations is just not a good thing in the climate realm. We have these discussions about climate justice, about just distribution of emissions, all of that. But somehow this is not yet true for nuclear weapons. And I think, at least in the mainstream debate. So I think here we have some room for interventions by both activists, but also scholars to say, you know what nuclear weapons are to international security, what fossil fuels are to a green economy. They're a costly legacy of past generations that take away the chance of future generations to construct a more just and a more sustainable security architecture. And that brings me to the last point that I wanted to make today. If we observe and analyze the political and temporal aspects of nuclear order, and I've tried to do that, so deterrence, nonproliferation, disarmament, past, present, future. If we do that, I think it would be good to not shy away from not only asking what this means for an order's legitimacy, but also for an order's capacity to sustain in the long term. So the question really is whether a political order neglecting justice, neglecting fairness concerns for a long period of time can actually sustain, especially if the injustice we're talking about is not just intra-generational, so between one generation, but intergenerational, so surpassing multiple overlapping or not overlapping generations. So this is really the question that has personally it haunted me ever since we started to work on this nuclear injustice framework. And there are, of course, also other interesting questions coming out of this, some of which have actually been pointed to by my fellow co-panelists in their articles, which I really encourage you to read because they're fantastic. And my personal hope would really be that some scholars pick up on these questions and indeed make this nuclear injustice agenda an agenda for change. So that's it from me, and I'll hand over back to Mariana. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was a great start, Franziska. Marie, I'll turn to you next. The floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mariana, and Managing the Atom for hosting me. I feel incredibly lucky to be following Franziska because the way that she laid out the political and temporal understandings of injustice fits so nicely into where I wanted to go with this conversation this morning. Today, I want to discuss the role of injustice in the nuclear order and how the intersectionality framework and the analysis of colonial legacies can be used to solve for more just and equitable policy solutions for the future. As we all know, we're in an incredibly tenuous time when it comes to the global nuclear world order. We're over a year into Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Putin is still posturing as he suspended the New START treaty, and the conversation around the current and potential nuclear powers, including China and Iran, are shifting every single day. But I think for most people around the globe, these are not the daily issues that they're thinking about when they're debating or having their morning cup of tea. That's because while all of these things are happening, the climate crisis continues to race forward and is becoming increasingly problematic. And despite many people's best efforts to ignore it, the global public health crisis still is raging on. Democracy feels like it's trending out. And for many Black and Brown people, racial injustice feels like it's at an incredible peak. And quite honestly, I would say on the most basic level across the globe, we're still in a cost of living crisis. So honestly, that, my friends, is a lot for an individual to think about on a daily basis. And that's why I argue that we cannot truncate or silo all of these problems. If we want people to see the connections between the nuclear weapons issues and the things that they are worried about, we need to think about, write about, talk about, and work on this issue differently. Since 1945, the global nuclear weapons complex has been rooted in colonial systems of power and white supremacy that started centuries ago. But activists like Martin Luther King, Coretta Scott King, Bayard Rustin, and the list goes on, taught us during the civil rights movement that there is an inherent link between issues of social justice and the existential threat of nuclear weapons. I know many of us will know, but Dr. King once stated, "It is a wonderful thing to integrate lunch counters, public accommodations, and schools. But it would be rather absurd to work to get schools and lunch counters integrated and not be concerned with the survival of the world in which we integrate." Those exact correlations stand true today. Yet the nuclear field has distinctly moved away from this concept and siloed these issues. But I argue that we don't have to continue this process moving forward. It's time for us to recognize there is a need for humanity in our security, especially as we talk about the nuclear weapons complex. Because at the center of this complex are people, and they're impacted by the choices that we make during conflict. Too often, scholars and academics, when we are weighing out the costs of war, we solely talk about the weapons. And we forget that people are at the crux of these fights. And most importantly, they are the ones that are impacted by this legacy of injustice. I'll take you back to when I first entered the nuclear field. I heard over and over and over how the general public, especially young people and people of color, either didn't understand or they didn't care about nuclear war. But I'll argue that the nuclear field actually lacked the ability to speak the language of these movements, the language that fought against injustice in order to create the prosperous, equitable, and just world that they were fighting for. And that resulted in these communities' perceptions that there was a lack of ability for us to care about their issues. Well, there are some nuclear security scholars who are explicitly making these connections between historical systems of oppression and the current issues of injustice, examining the harm resulting from the socio-political, cultural, economic, and ecological histories. It is still incredibly limited. And I would argue that's for a plethora of reasons. One, the incredibly high standard that the field has set for what it takes to be considered an expert. And understanding that expertise from scholarship almost always trumps one's lived experience. And an unfortunate erasure and an underappreciation for contributions by activists and scholars, both current and of previous generations, who have worked to make the nuclear issue intersect with proximate threats and issues of injustice. But before I go any further, I want to acknowledge that I've used the term intersect and intersectionality in the context of this presentation and in the context of the work that we've referenced here today. And I know that there are a lot of you here who probably understand this framework, but it's also something that has been getting an incredibly bad reputation over the last few weeks about being far left rhetoric or a tool of the liberal elite. So I think in this context, it's incredibly important that I very explicitly define what I mean. So for now, intersectionality is an all-encompassing ideology that more people should seek to understand. The primary focus of this framework is to look at two seemingly disparate issues, think about where they meet, and then analyze the impact they have on one another. And I recognize that might feel like a relatively simple solution. But again, I would argue that it is essential to being able to analyze and hopefully solve the myriad of complex issues that have been placed in front of us. I also want to acknowledge that this work has been happening in other fields for years. In the field of transitional justice, where I was privileged to study before I entered the nuclear field, they've been working under this framework for an extended period of time, using it to analyze the legacies of human rights abuses, particularly the impacts on people and the relationships between victims and perpetrators. They recognize that in order to work on these issues, you must also look at the human side of conflict. Utilizing this sociological framework of intersectionality, they review the interconnections between social categories, including but not limited to race, gender, and socioeconomic class. And while these three are incredibly essential categories, I argue that for the nuclear field, they can be expanded for our understanding of intersectionality and injustice, helping us to build a more holistic definition for what justice can mean in both the legal and the socio-cultural perspective, furthering our understanding of the impact of nuclear weapons. The use of nuclear intersectionality as an injustice framework as it pertains to the nuclear weapons complex is not limited to use. And it's not limited to the current conflict or this moment in time. It requires that we reflect on the legacies of these weapons, as well as their tangential impacts on all of these communities. As I referenced in my work, if we were to review the injustice of nuclear testing on the Marshall Islands, for example, we couldn't simply look at the current compact of free associations or the singular impact of those living on the 4 atolls. We would have to review the generational health impacts, the climate and ecological crises, socioeconomic disparities, the sociocultural legacies of living in diaspora for a larger Marshallese community. All of this is set in the context and in the wake of nuclear testing. If more scholarly attention was paid to these larger conversations around injustice as they impact and intersect the nuclear weapons complex, we would see a greater engagement from diverse populations, especially young people and people of color. Both of those groups have already shown their commitment to engaging in movements centered on justice, climate change, racial justice, militarism, and even, like I referenced earlier, public health. But most importantly, what they've demonstrated is that they have had a positive impact on policy changes through their work. They've demonstrated that there is an interconnectedness between all of these issues, and one movement's ability to solve their own issues is rooted in the success of another. Nuclear injustice and intersectionality could have similar impacts on movements and communities globally, creating greater safety and security for all. But that's only if nuclear policy scholars make a greater commitment to advance this framework. We must explore the nuances of these intersections between nuclear weapons complex and issues such as racial injustice, specifically addressing the effects of colonialism and white supremacy, acknowledging that the disproportionately negative impacts on Indigenous and people of color through things like Francesca said, uranium mining, the impacts of proxy wars, the impacts of policies and racialized language that we use to uphold the global nuclear order. We must continue to explore the climate impacts. And I'm not just talking about looking at the catastrophic damage that would be caused from the use of a nuclear weapon, but also the long-standing ecological impacts from previous testing, mining, and use. We have to explore militarism and divestment, because nuclear weapons budgets across the globe are continuing to balloon, and we are not addressing current issues of injustice, such as the global cost of living crisis. And quite honestly, the list can continue to go on. But that is why I argue that this work is essential. But I want to heed a word of caution. If we do take on this research framework of nuclear injustice, in order to be effective, we will need to pay incredibly close attention to who is included in such studies, authentically engaging with those impacted, specifically including marginalized voices in the framework in order for it to be holistic, just, and equitable. Research on these topics and incorporating these viewpoints can provide a direct and credible counterargument to the nuclear status quo. But we have to dare to be disruptive. The global nuclear order is based on an inherently unjust and inequitable system. But that doesn't mean we have to continue it forever. Everyone is impacted by the nuclear weapons complex, and it's going to take all of us to find justice and remove this work from the silo. If we're going to have a transparent global impact, including through our foreign policy and national security strategies, we must invest in scholarship that delves into these nuances of the nuclear injustice framework, realizing that there is a human side to security. Then we can push ourselves to find more equitable policy solutions that can help lessen the burden on communities, protect and provide remediation for vulnerable populations, and then reinvest funds in community resilience, safety, and care. This challenge that we have in front of us is actually about the people, but the opportunity is about a better humanity. And I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
That's fantastic, Marie. And you know, your discussion reminded me also of kind of looking into the consequences of something like a Chernobyl crisis and kind of the longitudinal effects of that go far beyond the immediate, right? The immediate explosion, the immediate mess, is just the livelihoods of people that have been disrupted, moved. Actually, the cultural legacy of that region of Ukraine, where a community no longer existed to perpetuate these and you know, to keep alive these cultural practices, that is all gone and lost to the cultural legacy of the world, basically. Like, it made us the poorer for it. So that's a really important point, and thank you for making it. Benoit, then you will help us wrap it all up and synthesize it and challenge us to think differently about some of these things.
Thank you, Mariana, for having me. Thanks, Francesca, for writing the piece. Thanks, Marie, for also responding, and good to meet you, as I said earlier. So I'll quite concisely engage with this framework of nuclear injustices, but I'll do it in quite a specific fashion. So I'm not going to talk about the scoping that Uli and Francesca have set for their own project. For instance, they talk about injustices with a focus on humans only, and not on all living beings, or not on the planet. So I'm not going to dispute that or engage with that. I'm not going to talk about their theory of change either, or the definition of justice. I'm not going to even, talk about, when we do intergenerational justice, how far into the future should we go, and how much weight should we give to future generations as opposed to past ones. And then at that point, we're like, why are we listening to that guy? What is he going to say? So what I'm going to do is simply look into how the framework as it is could be misconstrued as something that says there is such a thing as the nuclear peace, and it has a cost, and then essentially the injustice has to do with the cost of the nuclear peace. I'm going to essentially argue that if we think about injustices, starting from the standpoint of cooling the situation so far, the nuclear peace leads us to misconstrue the situation in quite fundamental ways. And then I'm going to focus on how we can avoid that misconstruction to get closer to what I think Francesca was trying to do. And if that's not the case, then she will essentially blame me and tell me why this is all wrong. So very simply, if you treat the nuclear peace as a valid descriptor of the nuclear world since 1945, you distort your thinking about justice or injustice in favor of nuclear weapons in at least 4 ways. First, you overstate the stabilizing effects of possessing nuclear weapons and the sustainability of a nuclear armed world, because you're essentially attributing all the cases of absence of unwanted nuclear explosions so far to the success of nuclear deterrence and the control practices that are associated with it, when what has been established is that, at least in some cases, what was necessary to avoid unwanted nuclear explosions was not practices of control, but their failure, or was elements that were independent from control practices. In other words, luck was necessary, and by calling it nuclear peace in retrospect, you create a retrospective illusion of perfect control, which would be inaccurate and would introduce a first pro-nuclear weapons bias. Second, calling it nuclear peace assumes that possessing nuclear weapons has been peace-inducive for the possessors, when in fact, the 1969 Sino-Soviet War, the many instances of attacks by non-nuclear countries against nuclear weapons possessors show otherwise. Third, bias in favor of nuclear weapons. One would assume, with the concept of nuclear peace, that practices of nuclear deterrence have not yet had a negative impact on climate change and planetary boundaries, which Uli and Francesca bring into the picture, but they bring as something to think about with a view to the future. Here, the point is, we don't yet have a good enough account of the impact of practices of nuclear deterrence on climate change and planetary boundaries. We have increasing great scholarship on the effects of nuclear testing and the nuclear origins of the Anthropocene, but we don't have like a complete account of the effects of nuclear practices on planetary boundaries overall. So that's kind of an avenue for future research. And then the fourth point would simply be that the choice to frame nuclear injustice in terms of distribution of the costs and benefits of the nuclear peace overstates the desirability of nuclear weapons by attributing to them the properties of stabilization and war avoidance. And one of the findings of my work, but also the work of Champa Biswas and many others, has been to show that we've overstated the desire for nuclear weapons, which has actually been very rare. So how do we talk about nuclear injustices without starting with this implicit set of assumptions about the benefits of the weapons? Simply, I would recommend starting by studying the effects of practices of nuclear deterrence in terms of costs and benefits without neglecting the domestic effects of nuclearization. And here I'm thinking about building on the work of Daniel Dudney and Thomas Fraisse and a few others, and how those costs and benefits are distributed instead of accepting the concept of nuclear peace uncritically. More specifically, taking the issue of the past role of luck seriously in a research agenda about nuclear injustice would require reframing the discussion of cases of near-nuclear use or close calls. Close calls we usually treat in a binary way with a dichotomy between explosion and non-explosion, which is conducive to a retrospective illusion of control, where every time we've avoided unwanted nuclear explosion, it was thanks to control. Instead, we need to become able to parse out the cases in which control was sufficient to avoid disaster from the cases in which it wasn't, the cases in which something irreducible to control was necessary. And those are the cases of luck, which were most likely underestimating because it took us 3 to 4 decades to understand the role of luck in the case of Cuba, and we're largely still dependent on the availability of archives, which are open in the US and the UK, much less in the other nuclear weapon states. And it's crucial that those lucky cases are included in the discussion of justice, because they mean that proponents of nuclear deterrence cannot take credit for the absence of nuclear explosions in those episodes, because the actions they took in the institutions they built, those same actions in those same institutions could equally, in those instances, have produced explosions. We need to keep that in mind if we want to talk about justice. A research agenda about nuclear injustice should certainly move beyond assumptions about the effects of possessing nuclear weapons and practicing deterrence on conventional war and climate change, and assess their actual effects in terms of material vulnerabilities and harm. I would recommend including epistemic effects as well, i.e., the fact that the practices of nuclear deterrence and the production of nuclear weapons have had effects on the production, validation, and confiscation of knowledge about the consequences of those things, which may affect the nuclear injustices by shaping knowledge about what actually happened. It is important, as I suggested, that a research agenda about nuclear injustice does not overstate the desire to possess nuclear weapons and carefully documents the fact that no nuclear weapons possessor ever reached that status without the help of at least one of the 5 UN Security Council permanent members. And it's also important to observe that no P5 member has a perfect track record of non-proliferation, and that the relationship between nuclear proliferation and disarmament still requires further study. So this further study can focus on its effects in terms of injustice precisely. I will conclude by suggesting 2 more things which go beyond what I wrote for this roundtable and connect with a more recent piece that I wrote with Sanna Verschuren on the issue of good faith and political possibility. Because if we think about justice, including the processes that lead from the past into the present, we should not assume that the power structures and the injustices that we have produced are the best possible ones, that all alternative worlds would have been worse anyway. So we need to become able to assess political possibilities in the past, as well as cases of good faith, bad faith, failure of imagination, and possible cases of malevolence, also in the production of this world. In IR, we're not equipped yet to assess the possibility of malevolence, and we are essentially inconsistent or overlooking cases of bad faith. And so this article takes a first step towards allowing us to open those questions, which I think are important if we want to talk about injustice. But again, this is just a modest supporting note for a research agenda on nuclear injustices, which I think is really crucial. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that intervention and for challenging our thinking about exactly how we conceptualize injustice. And with that, let me address my first question actually to you, Benoit. Something you have been researching and you have been saying for quite a while about the important role of luck, which I think is now sort of a lot more widely recognized through the recent works in historiography on the Cuban Missile Crisis, including your own, but also some other authors like Marty Sherwin and Sahib Pluhi and others. So we know that we have been lucky in a lot of these contexts, and luck played a huge role, although perhaps it's not an explanation for all of it, right? For every aspect of the so-called near misses being the actual misses, luckily for all of us. But without having to go back into the history and go into the archival documents and try to piece the story together, for the past year, we actually have been living and witnessing, the workings of deterrence, arguably. Right, we have a war in Europe that was unleashed by a nuclear weapon state that used its own, nuclear possession as this kind of shield for preventing others to come to Ukraine's help. Ukraine did not go to the UN and invoke Article 51 for collective defense because nobody would come to help. Not in kind of the kind of physical sense. It would be really quite embarrassing, right? And every discussion that we have in the field, but also discussion in Europe in the official circles about the fear of nuclear escalation, that is the workings of deterrence. But states are quite concerned, and they're careful about not making this worse, not kind of engaging with this conflict in such a way that could possibly, allow it to unravel and escalate. So the war is contained to the original theater, Ukraine, the original two belligerents, Ukraine and Russia. Nobody has joined the fray. And you can say that, well, it's really too bad for the Ukrainians, but in some grander consequentialist argument, at least we're avoiding, a big pan-European war, or this kind of specter of World War III has been thrown around quite a bit as well. So I think that touches upon Francisca's point that, there is a perception of benefits of nuclear weapons, that this idea of injustice is about kind of unequal distributions of benefits and costs, that, some people end up with a disproportionate kind of burden of costs, but other people actually do reap the benefits of it. So, the Poles are probably feeling pretty good about their membership in NATO right now. I imagine so are the Balts. So if you could address the question of how, just based on this case, how should we view and how should we treat these discussions of the alleged benefits of nuclear deterrence that seem to really present themselves, at least in this case of Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana, for always asking me easy questions, right? So let me try to say something about this. So, yeah, I think 3 steps. Step 1 is just an acknowledgement that nothing I say describes or addresses perceptions or how people feel about things. Everything I say about assessment of the role of luck is a retrospective, detached assessment that is there to just do one simple thing: distinguish cases in which control can take credit for the outcome from the cases in which it cannot. That's the only thing that the luck argument does. And so essentially the second point is, yes, it's now established in the scholarship, about past cases. Then the question is, are there more cases, which is very likely for the reasons I suggested? Certainly not, I'm not making the claim either that luck explains everything. That would be silly. I've never said that. And I'm not making either the claim that nuclear threats never have a deterrent effect. I'm simply saying we need to become able to parse out the cases in which nuclear threats were, necessary and sufficient to produce the outcomes, cases in which they were actually unnecessary because the deterrent effect was already there anyway, in cases in which they wouldn't have been sufficient because a third variable intervened. So that's, what I have in mind. Now, I took a long time to do this detour because it looks like Benoit is talking about the past and luck is a matter of the past. And in Ukraine, it's a different thing because it's the workings of deterrence. But my answer, which is going to be dramatically frustrating, is I would say we do not know that for sure yet. Sure, sure, it is the workings of deterrence, but in order for that to be meaningful in terms of is it luck or not, we would need to know whether everything has been perfectly controlled and there has not been any case of someone disobeying or a technological failure working for the better. And all I'm saying is we don't know that yet. In terms of the current situation, Maxime Pollery has written a piece in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists where he takes the luck framework and applies it to the Zaporizhia power plant. So essentially my answer to this is we cannot yet say luck doesn't apply in this case. All we can say is we don't yet have evidence that it does. So we may want to be on the cautious side, but we don't know yet for sure. Then once that is said, the claims about if there is such a thing as nuclear peace, the practice of nuclear deterrence produces injustices the way Francesca has outlined them, I have no issue at all with that claim. What I'm saying is, if you frame it in terms of nuclear peace, you're simply assuming a whole series of benefits which may or may not be there. But I don't have issues with the principal claim of nuclear deterrence producing injustices. If that's where you wanted to take me, no, I have zero issues with that claim. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I think you're right that we still have to be cautious, and the kind of participant observer kind of model has its own limitations. But perhaps there is a way to reconcile and maybe move beyond the either or, deterrence or luck, and see how those two interact and amongst other factors, and kind of do justice to both of these elements, right, in crisis dynamics. Next I'll have just a short question for Franziska, and something also Marie mentioned in her presentation, the fact that perhaps again contingent on this whole post-Cold War journey with nuclear weapons kind of losing their luster as a kind of main focus for international advocacy, for many of the kind of public awareness and social movements sort of situations. We do see now we live in a world where kind of nuclear issues are the purview of the so-called experts, right? Whether they be people in DC, people in academia, and so forth. And it has become an increasingly a niche subject matter with which to engage. Marie exposed how intersectionality is one of the ways in which you can get people engaged with these subjects by appealing or addressing something that they actually care about, and that is part of their own daily kind of problems and lived experience. But I just wonder if maybe both you, Franziska, and you, Marie, could share or offer some ideas of how exactly do we do that, because there's also a fact that it could be quite patronizing for all of us from our little perch to come down to the communities that trying to grapple with, as Marie described, some everyday problems, and tell them that they need to start caring about nuclear weapons in the same way maybe as community, as young people generation care about climate change, right, which is kind of a bigger and more an issue that commands greater public awareness. So how do we do that? How do we communicate the issues of nuclear injustice without kind of being patronizing about it, and without saying people what they should care about, instead of doing it in a more just and equitable way? Franziska, maybe, and Marie, you're also welcome to.
Yeah, I think actually Marie will be the one that can probably answer this best, because she's really the one that is doing this on an everyday basis. Well, I think the thing is, we're kind of like entering now an interesting period in time, right? Because you said like it is a niche subject matter, but like in the last year we've had headlines about nukes more than ever. So I think now is really the time to actually try this and say, okay, we have been seeing this connection, this intersection for a while. Now is the time to actually make the point and try to get people behind that. And I think it's not only in the nuclear sphere where people start to realize, oh, well, maybe we have to pay attention to justice perceptions. I think especially Western countries have realized in the last few months that they can't advocate for their vision and their way of ordering if they keep ignoring justice perceptions of certain marginalized actors. And I think now that we kind of like have a very sad example of the concrete cost of that. I mean, I hate to capitalize on this, but like this can actually awake people to the problem. So I'm not the expert to like how in communication, I'll be honest here, but like really showing that this is costly and that this is costly right now and also will be. That is something we can probably build on. And I think here the argument about intergenerational injustice is so important, because it can actually get probably young people to care. And it is what got me to care about this whole issue. Like, I don't find it just, and I don't find it acceptable that we have this security architecture. And when the war started, or the full-scale war started, I was incredibly angry, and I was kind of like exhausted, because I felt like, okay, like we've been working towards disarmament and arms control and all of this, and somehow my generation got inherited this incredibly unjust security architecture, and I want to change that, right? So now I'm not speaking as an academic, but just like as a young person. And I think here we can, you know, similar to the climate issue, where young people were actually the ones caring about that. Well, I mean, they should equally care about nuclear weapons, and I'll leave it to Mary to explain how we can do that in practice, because I think you can do that actually better than I can.
I actually think one of the key things that you just said there, when you said I'm not speaking as an academic, I'm speaking as a young person, is exactly what I'm talking about when I say that those things have to connect. I often tell people the reason I think I advocate so deeply for the intersectionality work is because my life is a bunch of intersections. I am a Black woman living in America. That means that every time I enter any conversation, all of those pieces of me are essential to how I view the outcomes of the things that we're talking about. And I think, Mariana, your question is incredibly important, because one of the things that I've cautioned folks against is understanding the authentic outreach in doing this work and creating connections. Unfortunately, for a long time, when people were doing this work and they were reaching out to these disparate communities, that's exactly what they were doing. They were yelling, "This is the most important thing. Why do you not understand that this is the most important thing?" But if you're trying to feed your family, if you're thinking about climate change, if you're worried about police brutality, this is not the most important thing. And there, by no means should we sit here and tell somebody that their issue is less important than the one that we're bringing forward. And in that case, the thing that I think I've been employing is a very simple tactic of meeting people where they are, full stop. That means if I'm going to enter a conversation with climate activists, I'm going to stop, I'm going to listen, I'm going to understand what are the key issues very specifically of their community, because a climate activist in Germany looks very different than a climate activist in Flint, Michigan. And they have very different conversations that they want to have about the ways that the ecological and climate impacts are impacting their communities. And that's something that we need to understand right off the bat for any movement that we are going to start to engage with. And once I fundamentally understand what are some of the key areas that folks are working on, or places where they see injustice in their movements, that is when I can start to have a conversation about, and let me explain to you how the nuclear world order tacks on to the problems that you already have. I think here in the United States, I talk to a lot of racial justice advocates, and they talk about policing and militarism. It is a full-scale system of how you get from policing in this country to the use of nuclear weapons. And we can have that conversation. When we're looking at impoverished communities and the ways that they've been disenfranchised, we can talk about the ways that the nuclear weapons budget is siloing money, and we are not able to reinvest that in things like community infrastructure and education. Those are very tangible ways for me to say to people, this is not just about a far off land or a far off crisis or a past thing. That is a way to say you have a very real problem in front of you. This thing happening over here that you probably weren't thinking about is impacting that as well. And if we work together, emphasis on working together, we can create the safety and remove some of the oppression and injustice that you're feeling in your day-to-day life. So, like I said earlier, on a most basic level, employing the tactic of listening first, talking second is probably the strongest thing that we can do from both a scholarly and an activist perspective. And I think that's why I encourage the research into this space so that we can better equip actors who are going out to engage and speak and work fairly and authentically with more communities than just us talking in the silo.
Excellent. And, you know, I see there's a very long intervention by, and I might mispronounce, Hernan Villagran in the Q&A box in the chat. And one of the things that he mentions is bringing in scientists and, you know, from natural sciences into this conversation. And again, making these interactions interdisciplinary, you know, again, not, you know, being kind of trapped by the bounds of one's own subject matter and one's own disciplinary conventions and things like that, that great things could could happen from that sort of intersectionality, as it were. I have one
Mariana,
more
before
question.
we move on, sorry,
Yep.
can I just build
Of
on one
course.
thing Marie said on that question? Because what you said about engaging with how people are affected. To me, I mean, what we found in the surveys of 5 European countries is an attitude of essentially people being exposed to sudden fear. So, Russian threats, or before that, Trump's fire and fury speak. So moments of like panic and back to apathy, and like not essentially nuclear weapons don't feature in your daily life. So you're not thinking about them. And why would we blame you for not thinking about something that you've never been, informed about? But the point here is, the first step, a lot of our interviewees, kind of when we force them to think about, are you going to care what you're going to do? They would make a claim that, look, either nuclear war, let's say catastrophic nuclear events happen in our lifetime, and then we're done and there's nothing we can do about it, or they don't, and then we're better off and happier not thinking about them. So the thing is, they assume they have a choice to be affected or not. And so to me, really the entry point for us is to say, we're not telling you what you should do, but we're telling you you don't have that choice. You're already affected as a citizen, as a target, as a taxpayer, and as, a member of an unjust system. Then you can choose to be active or passive in the face of that. But you don't have that choice of not being affected.
That's a fantastic point. That's thank you for making that. My last question is to all three of you, and it's going to be an intentionally provocative question. All right. So our idea here is really to foster kind of a debate and tackle really difficult questions, and not to create, some sort of echo chambers that we know are counterproductive. So I did hear in a lot of I hear it a lot outside, and I heard it in your presentations, references to past kind of sins of colonialism and the system that was created through these practices. And of course, in the longue durée, we see how sort of kind of this European system that kind of colonized the world in more than one way, and more than just geographic way, and the patterns of thinking and the patterns of doing things, right, and the kind of patterns of economy and so forth, is responsible for setting up the kinds of world in which all of us live, anywhere that we are. But more specifically today, in the nuclear realm, we do have nuclear possessors that are former colonial powers, right? At least the three of them under the NPT. The United States, maybe an emporium, if not a classical colonial power, as a sort of imperium, I should say, if not an empire. And then, of course, the past colonial powers of Britain and France that have done all the kind of nasty things colonial powers do, including in terms of nuclear weapons testing, and how that affected people, not on their own territory, but elsewhere. Normally, people, lands inhabited by indigenous communities and less privileged communities. But many nuclear possessors today are themselves former colonial subjects, India and Pakistan. They're outside of the nonproliferation regime. They're not even bound by the very feeble, one could say, obligations that at least NPT somehow bestows on the P5. There's Israel that seems to be an exception to every rule there is, and we hardly even mention it as a nuclear possessor. We focus very disproportionately on nuclear proliferation of DPRK and now Iran, but we somehow forgotten that there are 3 nuclear possessors outside of the NPT, and we have increasingly normalized their nuclear possession, and we don't hold them, I feel, to the same standard, when we discuss these things. Russia, formerly the Soviet Union, Russia seems to be a separate case of its own, because frankly speaking, as someone who has a background and was born in the Soviet Union, and there seems to be a leeway that a lot of the progressive discourses have given historically to a country like the Soviet Union without fully recognizing its own colonial practices, right? There seemed to be, pretty much just as much a colonial power in different guise as perhaps the other ones were. And now this is very much a type of a colonial war against Ukraine. And we see, the countries that should have been at the forefront of this anti-colonial discourse, like India and like Pakistan, taking a very qualified view of the whole thing, kind of based on their own very particularistic national interests. And then, so my question is, how do we reconcile, is colonial framework a kind of systemic way that's most helpful to think about these nuclear injustices anymore? So there is, of course, an element to it, but what are the other frameworks that might augment, that framework to better understand where these injustices come from? And also, how do we transcend this kind of perpetrator victim dichotomy? Because by constantly, it seems, doing that, we perpetuate this narrative of victimhood, and to acknowledge victims and to do them justice is the right thing to do, but at some point you need to move on. Otherwise, you just reify this kind of dichotomy indefinitely. Again, a very easy question to all of you, but if we could have let's just start with Francisca, you and Marie and Benoit in that order.
Well, okay, I'll try. Okay. So I think like you mentioned, for example, India and Pakistan, and not really, condemning this, right? But then again, I think it's not something that is due to their heritage necessarily. I think this specifically is more like because they have nuclear weapons, themselves. And I think we can see part of like similar, lines of argumentation actually also in Western states. For example, France ramping up the whole responsible nuclear weapons state narrative in response to this war. Of course, there's a clear condemnation, but I think like the defensive attitudes towards nuclear deterrence is something that, all nuclear weapon states share, and that they've been really careful about to continue also after this war, to be like, well, this is really bad what Russia is doing. And it is, it is irresponsible. And I agree, it is, but kind of like trying to draw a line between, well, this is irresponsible, but what we do is still responsible. You know what I'm saying? So this whole framework, I think, is not something that is, I think it is something that all nuclear weapon states do. So I think here, this is, not really distinct to a few of them. Well, I think, like Mary said earlier, the whole colonial perspective is, of course, super important to kind of like invest the past injustices. But then again, if we let go of that framework, of course, we kind of like, we miss the point that these things are still, so relevant today. So I would kind of like defend this as being still super, super relevant in this current context. But yeah, that's it probably from me, and I'll hand over to the next person to go from here.
Yeah, this is a super easy question. I feel really confident in how we're going to go through this one. But I think the first thing that I'll start with is, we're not in a place where we can decouple colonial legacy from our current standpoint. When you think about any of these powers, either Western or non-Western, the impacts of colonialism are very much seeped and entrenched in the ways that systems are operating. And I'm not just talking about the nuclear system, but just the ways in which the global world order is structured, the ways in which we talk about Western nations versus non-Western nations, the rhetoric in which we use, the ways in which we engage and provide agency to certain places, but not to others. That is very much seeped in our understanding of colonial legacies and the impacts that colonization has had on certain countries. I also want to acknowledge a very important fact when we talk about colonization. I think in my piece, I talked a lot about coupling colonization and white supremacy in a very similar tact. And I want to acknowledge that upholding these systems of white supremacy and colonization are not exclusive to Western or white countries. You can uphold these systems by being adjacent and just practicing in the same oppressive manners in which they have previously engaged. And that's something that we have to be really clear about and acknowledge. And I think the last thing I'll say to your point about victimhood and when do we let go of people being victims, we have to first find redress and remediation for what is caused. I think there's a difference between imparting a notion of victimhood on a country or on a group of people and providing agency for them to speak about the legacies of things that have happened to them. We have not yet come to a place where we are able to actively engage with those who have been impacted, not just by actual catastrophic events, but also testing, mining, et cetera. We have not done a good enough job, both as Western powers, nuclear holders, and just the world in general, of acknowledging what has happened. So until we get to a place where there is a baseline order of everybody's understanding of there was a problem here, there were people impacted here, and they are due recourse and redress for what's happened, we have to continue to sell those narratives and tell those stories, because once we do that, I do hopefully believe, then we will be able to provide the agency necessary for those countries and those communities and those people to advocate on their own behalf. But right now, the way that we have these orders situated, those people aren't even in the rooms to talk up for themselves. So we really have to shift our understanding of like, what is a victim and who is engaged. And I think the final thing that I'll say is, there is nuance to the language that we use when we're talking about the nuclear powers. Who is a sane nuclear power? Who is a safe nuclear power? Who should we be fearful? That is incredibly drawn over racialized lines that often find itself creating a negative image of places like Pakistan and India. And what do they do, this boogeyman, when we can actually see the ways in which Putin's posturing is impacting people in real time on the European continent. So we have to be very careful and nuanced to say that everybody is being engaged with at the same level. And we really have to get everybody to the table before we can have a real conversation about what disarmament and getting rid of these weapons looks like, because they're all going to have to do it at the same time.
Okay, so I'll try to add a few things to this in answer to your question, Mariana. I think I would say three things. One is about concepts and framings and how they're all selective, right? So you were asking us about the boundaries and the effects of choosing colonialism as a framework. So Marie was making a case, if I understood her well, again, for bringing in intersectionality and not just ratifying colonialism as the one framework, but like each framework is gonna essentially invisibilize some things and emphasize others. The two frameworks that I would want to just suggest here, one simply is an ism that has lost its glory. It's exterminism that was crafted by historian E.P. Thompson in the 80s, which is, and I'm bringing it up because you made the point, Mariana, about the Soviet Union usually not being included in the critique of colonialism. And E.P. Thompson's point was to say, wait, the Soviet Union is an exterminist power structure, as is the overarching nuclearist regime. So that's one way of not letting the Soviet Union off the hook, exterminism. Another framework simply is state violence, right? Because, you know, nuclear testing is a form of state violence, for instance. And then I think in terms of who to focus on, I would say the combination of the concept of nuclear winter. So the fact that there are a limited number of states capable of producing the end of civilization as we know it through nuclear winter. So that material capability of causing harm, to me, suggests that at least we should pay particular attention to documenting the effects of what they do. And maybe this is me being a scholar here, but again, you know, until recently, we didn't have, and I don't think we still have, a complete account of the effects of nuclear testing. I don't think we have a good enough account of the effects of those practices on the possibility of democracy and on other effects. Similarly, if you take a subset of the states capable of producing nuclear winter, you notice that some of them are permanent members of the Security Council with a responsibility to ensure peace and security. That responsibility is there. They took it on. So I think that makes it also normatively acceptable to hold them accountable to those standards, because that's the role they agreed to play. So, you know, essentially part one of my answer was multiple concepts allow you to zoom in on particular consequences of state actions. Part two was to say, let's do the empirical work of documenting the effects, because we're not done with that. And that's actually really hard to do. And part three on moving beyond victimhood, the only modest thing I would say on that front is, I think, to recreate agency, it's important to, you know, make the effort that I suggested earlier about, okay, but to recreate agency, how do you distinguish between good faith and bad faith? And how do you set the boundaries of what's possible? Because otherwise you say we re-give you agency in a system in which you cannot do anything. So that would be my modest suggestion to address your question. Thank you.
Yes, very, very good and thought-provoking interventions. Thank you all very much. I'll take a few questions from our esteemed audience that's with us. There's a question, a perennial problem for all of us, or challenge, I should say. We don't like using the word problem in the United States. From Julia Cournoyer, I'm sorry if I mispronounced it, but it's a question about funding and how do we support this research agenda that clearly is very necessary, and, you know, adjudicate. How do we convince the funders to adjudicate these conflicting priorities? And I'll take another one that's sort of connected from Doug Shaw, who talks about engaging with people who sort of enact and uphold practices of deterrence, right? Because, and I think that's a very important question. Like, if we are to make a dent in this system, you know, that there is a need to engage directly with all sorts of actors, not just the ones that will be sympathetic to our arguments. And, you know, this is a very entrenched system that will be very difficult to nudge. And we see sort of the re-entrenchment of it right now as well, with the modernization program, with, again, the effects of the war in Ukraine, where a lot of people are saying, let's have a safe and secure and reliable deterrent for as long as it takes. So how do we bring this topic of international nuclear injustice to people who perhaps have this myopic view of, you know, this is our national security and it works for us, and this is the best we can do? Let's go in the reverse order. Benoit, maybe you could start us off first.
I was secretly hoping I was going to have 2 minutes to think about it. Too bad. So I guess, yeah, I guess I'll take the questions in the order you asked them. The first one really, No, okay, no, so I'll do it the other way around. How do you engage the stakeholders of nuclear deterrence? I think one way is to engage them with the imagined future discussion and say, look, the time frame of the nuclear modernization programs, which is pushing us into the future 5 to 7 decades, that is, for most nuclear weapon states, much longer than the time they've spent with nuclear weapons. And just tell them, like, look, okay, most of this debate, the debate about deterrence and how much is enough and all of that, to me, assumes particular figures of the possible enemy. The possible enemy is either an enemy that is deterrable only with nuclear weapons, and so then we need to keep them for that enemy, or it's an enemy that is deterrable with nuclear weapons and other capabilities. And then the question is, okay, how do we, allow non-nuclear capabilities to ensure nuclear missions? But it seems to me that you can simply make the case that, look, over 7 decades, you can bet on the fact that this is the future. But there are 2 very different types of conceivable futures that would force you to have very different priorities. And you need to tell me why you're betting on that one rather than the others. So I'll briefly lay out what the other 2 are. One is simply a world in which nuclear weapons become hackable, or institutions plan as though they are, even if that's not the case. And there is, scholarship on that, like Herb Lynn, Andrew Fetter, several others. But like, if you take that seriously, the desirability of those weapons collapses, and the need to dismantle them fast increases. So that's one. But more importantly, we're not living on a nuclear island, right? We're living on a planet which has boundaries and is experiencing rapid climate change. If it turns out that in the next 70 years, we're facing an existential disaster that essentially destroys us, and we've spent resources on nuclear weapons that therefore either created risk or hasn't allowed us to reallocate to address those ones, are we going to say, that was success of nuclear deterrence? Or are we going to say, that's a major opportunity cost? So really thinking about what's your imagined future, don't, in telling them, like, you talk as though nuclear weapons protect you against all state threats. And just say, like, look, not even that, because if there is a nuclear war between India and Pakistan, nuclear winter will affect you, and your nuclear weapons will not help you. So get them to think about the shape of the futures. That would be my answer. Can you remind me of the other question, please?
It was about the funding in the field.
2 sentences on the funding. One is simply, and here I apologize, I'm going to have to tell you to go see a piece that I did with Shil Vegeland in international relations, showing, or surprise, that what happens everywhere else also happens in the nuclear realm, which is that if analysis is funded by vested interests, it produces biases. Totally unsurprising finding, granted, but most of the field assumes that it doesn't apply. Turns out it does. So once you've said that, the implication is to switch the burden of proof, ask for transparency about the funding, ask media agencies to display the funding and not just say expert from think tank A, say expert from think tank A funded by entities A, B, C, and D. And then essentially the third element is simply to say, good news, actually, guys. Because if one thinks about which are the findings, which are the concepts that changed nuclear weapons policy, they didn't cost much. Nuclear winter coupled with, Carl Sagan and the freeze movement and a context, sure. But this concept, which went all the way like to Gorbachev, that's like 5 scholars. So we shouldn't pretend that disruptive research is extremely costly. No. Status quo research is everywhere extremely costly, and not particularly useful, but useful at entrenching status quo. So just use that finding to say vested interest funding are a problem and avoidable, and disruptive new knowledge, also by nuclear tests, is achievable and not that costly.
Fantastic. And before Marie, you take on, I just wanted to highlight something. I wanted to highlight is the work of our colleague Sébastien Philippe on the nuclear testing, French nuclear testing in French Polynesia, and something he basically stumbled upon in his research and has taken, a great effort in actually publishing the cover-ups and the kind of misrepresentations of the effects of nuclear testing on Indigenous peoples there. So just wanted to spotlight his work. Marie, the floor is yours.
I'm going to try and couple these two questions together, and let's see how well I do this. I want to pick up on something Benoit said about upholding the status quo. And I think that really touches on what Doug's question was. Obviously, Hazel O'Leary, we are very thankful in the US that she was able to say that we need to declassify some of these nuclear secrets, the things that are vital, and that has been essential. But she was an outlier of somebody in the government who didn't necessarily uphold deterrence theory, and who while she fundamentally understood that the nuclear weapons complex was an essential part of the US power making and the US power across the globe, it did not mean it had to be that way forever. I think for a lot of people, I think especially in Western governments, they only know one theory. Like they quite literally have only been taught one framework to thinking because we've been using nuclear weapons as a security upholding piece for so long in our understanding of how we do colonialism and imperialism around the globe. I agree with Benoit's theory that we have to talk about the world of possibilities beyond the bomb. We have to talk about what safety and security look like beyond this moment of the utilization of nuclear weapons. I want to specifically highlight safety, because safety for most people is a different thing than security, particularly for populations who feel like security is an oppressive action upon them. And that is how a lot of people feel living in these Western countries, particularly disenfranchised folk. So we have to change the rhetoric in which we engage in these conversations. That also goes back to something I earlier said about meeting people where they are. We cannot have the same conversations with every single political actor and think that we are going to get different results. Different people require different conversations and different entry points to talk about our issues and ways to change the landscape. That requires us to humble ourselves in some of these conversations. I know we know the best way forward. I know we have all the scholarship. I know we have all the policy acumen. But sometimes just to get people to get on your page, you have to figure out where the disconnect is, and then how do you flip the switch? And that's difficult, especially when you don't agree with the ideology that somebody is putting forward. Definitely been in that scenario. But the reason, to Julia's question, that it's essential that we invest in these nuclear injustice theories is because some of these theories are going to be the things that flip the switch for people. I think for a lot of folks in government, what is the thing that flips the switch? Their constituents, the people that are voting them, the people that are putting them in power. That means that we need to have the funded research that very clearly shows how this is impacting people, and then say, this is about more than just our security complex. This is how your people are going to see it when we put it in the media, when we put activist actions, when scholars are teaching about this in their classrooms. You have a problem now when they're going to come to you and say, well, why are we funding this? And so I think these two things are incredibly coupled in terms of understandings of what we need to do to have these conversations in a government context, but also what we need to be saying to funders about, if you want to make changes, you're actually going to have to invest in the disruptive work that is going to make the changes you hope to see. And I think the final thing I'll say is the nuclear weapons complex unfortunately, and nuclear justice in particular, is sadly a victim of the lack of interest of DEI and other things that are occurring right now. We're 3 years out from when George Floyd was murdered. Everybody across the globe was so keenly engaged in the equity and justice for Black people and people of color. We have seen in Western society in particular a very stark and very deep turn for a reality to want to disengage with this interest, with this field of thought, for a plethora of reasons. People of color who are impacted do not get to turn off this work. I don't get to walk away from injustice just because it's no longer convenient or fun for people to engage with. The thing that we have to hold funders and governments accountable for is, you said you were going to do this work. You said you were going to fund this work. This work is essential to creating the world we want to see. And we are going to keep talking about it until you actually do it. So those are the things that I would say on both of those questions.
Bravo. That was a very powerful intervention. Thank you so much, Marie. And Francisca, over to you.
Well, I'll try to add a bit, because I mean, that is one of the main criticism and one of the main pushbacks that that Uli and I actually got for our piece. It was, like, oh, you say all of this is unjust, but so what? How do you get people to care that are super happy with nuclear deterrence and that are actually happy to have security at the cost of everyone else? So I'll try to that's actually something that I've been trying to think about. So to get these people, you often have to offer these explanations that basically show them that it is in their interests to care. So I'll try that, but I don't think it's like the main thing. The main thing is really value-based, but okay, I'll try the interest thing too. So I think kind of like a nuclear justice is about, perceptions of states about people. And these perceptions, they won't go away. And kind of like this justice motive that has, been described by several scholars, that basically says that there is a desire that systemic principles of ordering are, equitable, are just, so that the participation and distribution of in that order is somehow just. And this motive, I think, won't go away. And we can see that it is getting, more and more important in different policy fields. So I think there is a reason to this, like really, to the slogan of there's no peace without justice, right? So if you want to have peace, and in that case, peace of mind for these states, you at some point have to pay attention to justice concerns by actors, because you will get challenged if you continue what you do right now. And at some point you will have to pay attention to that, and you can't just ignore away a humanitarian initiative, right? At some point you have to address the arguments that they're making. So I would argue, if you want to convince these people, you just have to tell them it is in your interest to address these justice concerns, because otherwise you will get in trouble later on. But as I said, this is the interest-based kind of like advocacy strategy for deterrence actors. But I want to make a strong case for, well, actually a value-based approach here, and say, I do think if we want to address nuclear injustice, we have to aim for some sort of, nuclear disarmament, because if you ask for anything less, you basically contradict your own claims. Because if you say, okay, well, we'll just reduce nukes for a bit, or all of these things, you basically accept that a certain justices will prevail and will stay with you. So kind of like the level of ambition here, and I'm not saying that because I think it's easy done and it's like really reachable, but the level of ambition, the theoretical kind of like ambition that we have to raise must, of course, be one of disarmament, because only then we can really address the nuclear injustice in its entirety. And that's it from me.
Thank you so much. As Francisca, as you were talking, it reminded me of something, of a sort of profound thing I heard from a Harvard Kennedy School professor, Brian Hare, who taught a really interesting course on ethics of violence, and he was formerly the dean of Harvard Divinity School, is Catholic clergyman, and he described the NPT at one point as a consequentialist solution to a deontological problem. And I think we see that even in terms of consequentialism, certainly over the past several few years, we see even in terms of consequentialist argument that system might be failing, failing lots of its participants and lots of its actors. So let me, we have exhausted our time and even gone over time. So I thank everyone for staying on with us for this important discussion. And let me just, let me thank all of you for Zooming in, and all of the attendees for staying with us. Thank you all for the very important work that you do. I think we'll look for more publications and for advancing this agenda. And as you say, it's a business not only for the people who are engaged in researching nuclear injustices. This is something all of us have to be mindful of, and all of us have to account for in our work, whichever part of the nuclear pie we tackle. With that, the seminar is adjourned. It's over. Thank you all very, very much. Let me just remind you again that the recording and transcription of this will be online. So you can go back and revisit it, or recommend it to people who couldn't make it today. Thank you all very much.